All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Quick sound check. Everybody hear me okay? I feel like it's doing pretty well. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I do want to do a quick show of hands. How many of you in this room have less than 3 years of experience in identity? Awesome. I love that because last year we had a little bit of a challenge where a lot of very kind people were here supporting myself and the other speaker. And we had some people who were new to identity who couldn't get in the room, and I hated that. So I'm glad we're not repeating that mistake. So my name is Lance Peterman, and I will be talking to you today on an introduction to identity. Very briefly, I'm going to talk more about me in a second, which hopefully will be a little bit more fun perspective, but I am the platform lead at Dick's Sporting Goods for Identity and Access Management. I am also an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Very briefly, this is kind of our roadmap. We're going to, because this is an introduction to identity, we're going to go a mile wide and an inch deep. So this is not going to be too terribly technical, but we will get into some. And hopefully we're going to leave time for questions. So, oftentimes identity, along with security, is thought of as a race. But what kind of race is it really? What happens if we get to the end of that race, or do we ever reach that? And I would posit that we never truly reach the end of the race because theoretically the end of the race in the security of identity context is we have officially secured all the identities, we've officially secured all the things. And you can probably see just by virtue of me saying that, that's an impossible task, right? So what I would say is that it's more of a journey, and we'll talk more about that. So first, let's talk about briefly what this thing identity is, whether it's a field, it's an area, it's an industry, it's a discipline, it's a specialty, it's all of those things. It's also these things, but not just. So you have identity, and I'll warn you now, you will see a lot of three-letter acronyms throughout this. I will do my best to explain those. If for some reason I fail in that account, feel free to call me out on that. But you see here, conventionally speaking, this is kind of what identity and access management is viewed as. You have identity governance and administration. You have access management. You have privileged access management. And that's kind of the conventional wisdom in this regard. As you'll discover through this masterclass, it's a lot more than that. And so let's set an even bigger context. You see, again, more three-letter acronyms, four-letter acronyms. You even see words thrown around like consent and trust. And I assure you, all of these slides will be made available to you. Both through my blog and also, I believe, through the conference app as well. But this is just, again, just introducing some of those terms like KYC, know your customer. We'll pick another one, PKI, public key infrastructure. That's a talk into itself. So this is kind of some of the what, but we're going to dive a lot more into that. And then we ask the question, well, who is identity for? The short answer is everybody, right? You can't navigate in this universe, in this digital realm, without the context of identity. But for the purposes of this masterclass, we're talking about identity professionals. A lot of you are in the room. Developers, project managers, auditors, yes, even auditors, product owners and executives. And they're all serving these constituencies. And we're going to talk about those constituencies a little bit more in a second. But the next piece that I want to talk about, and this is sort of in the vein of, we are in Vegas after all, and one of the most popular things at Vegas is a magic show, right? One of my colleagues last night went to Penn and Teller's show. I don't know if anybody else got a chance to see it. So we're going to do a little bit of dose of magic when we talk about why. Why does identity exist? And for that, I would like to ask for a volunteer from the audience. This gentleman right here has been randomly selected, was not briefed before this talk, and I can assure you has no awareness what is in this deck. But sir, if you would like to pick up that microphone that happens to be conveniently located right next to you, do you have some thoughts about, well, first of all, what is your name, sir?
My name is Espen Bago.
Espen Bago. So Espen, why do we have identity, do you think?
So I'm lucky to have some opinions on this. So
okay.
Good that I was selected. So we talked about who, right? So this is a presentation about perspectives. And I think you want to give us as many perspectives as possible because that helps us understand and it helps us communicate to others, right? one of the perspectives is what we are protecting. And you always need to keep in mind, what is it that is the resource that is not limitless? So, can I borrow the clicker, by the way?
You can. It's a demanding volunteer.
So keep in mind the object, right? You always want to know what is the object that's most important to protect at this point. What types of objects do we like to protect or do we need to protect? So typically that's anything that's not, let's see the pointer. If it's not limited, I mean, if it's water or air and it's freely available for anything, we don't need IM. But as soon as someone wants to make a business out of it, or we don't want anything shared, we need control mechanisms, right? And for perspectives, those types of things can fall into different categories. For example, my own personal data, things I own, my Google Photos, or things that are managed for me in the enterprise sector, for example. So just to give you, make it a bit more easy to remember, let's say these objects that we protect are, well, some sort of shiny thing here. There are always subjects that want to access that. And then what we do is we put up rules saying that, well, there needs to be a specific condition for you to access that. You can't access that whenever you want to. For example, this object, right? It wouldn't help if anyone was able to touch it at any given point.
Is that a Van Gogh?
Sorry?
Is that a Van Gogh?
That's Van Gogh. That's the Starry Night. That's the original, actually.
That's the limit of my art expertise, by the way.
So we have rules, but rules are meaningless unless we have some means of enforcing them, right? And those are our IAM controls. So we put up barriers that help us enforce those rules. And what we typically do in the processes of IAM is that we have mechanisms to bypass or get through those barriers. Permissions, for example. Privileges that we deal out. And that's the thing that's important for all of us to keep track of how we're doing that. What's the mechanism for creating that permission slip?
For full disclosure, I do not believe you can actually acquire a permission slip to touch a Van Gogh. I'm no expert on that.
But depending on what the rule said, right?
Yes. And so that was our first magic trick. Everybody thank Espen, please.
I'll just stay here a bit in case you need me.
Absolutely. Feel free. So that permission slip in the identity realm or the digital realm can be known as a bearer token. And sometimes it has information like this, and you look at that and you're like, well, that's kind of meaningless in this current context. That's okay. So let's talk about a real-world example. I'm curious, has anybody in the room heard of or participated in something known as parkrun? Whoa, this analogy is not going to land. Oh, I got one. Awesome. Okay. So parkrun probably plays a little bit better in Europe than it does here in the United States. It was actually created in the UK. And it's basically a free 5K that anybody can participate. It runs every week in certain localities throughout both America and in Europe. And I happen to participate in one in Charlotte. And so one of the things that caused me to introduce this into the masterclass was it has a really nice digital analog in the physical realm. And what you see on the screen here is a token. And basically what happens when you do a park run, you go out, you run a predefined course, which is always 5K in length. And once you finish, you come back and you say, you receive a token in this form. And then I take my token, and along with my pre-registration, so my digital identity as a park runner, I show that to the scanner, and they scan my barcode, they scan my token code, and I'm issued a time. And that's how you figure out how that works. So it establishes kind of a nice context, which we'll touch on a little bit later, in terms of, again, another reason why identity exists. But what we're going to do now is we're going to flip into kind of the next version of this story to add on to it in the form of identity context. And selfishly, I'm going to use me as an example. So as I mentioned, I am an employee 3 times. I am obviously a member of the workforce at Dick's Sporting Goods. I am also a member of the adjunct faculty at UNC Charlotte. And I'm also a precinct official at Mecklenburg County's Board of Elections. So I help run our local elections. And so I'm an employee in 3 different contexts. I'm also a customer in 2 different contexts. I buy products at Dick's Sporting Goods, a little probably more frequently than my wife would like. I buy products at UNC Charlotte when I dine there, things of that nature. I am also, in my context as a professor, I also happen to have attended school at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. So I'm also an alumnus. Within the context of being a precinct official, I also happen to be a voter. And you're probably getting the idea here. I'm also a consumer. I'm also a citizen. I pay taxes within those jurisdictions. And the final one that I didn't really mention is I'm also a patient. And hopefully everybody in this room has come to learn over time how critical our patient data is, not just from a privacy standpoint, although that's certainly probably the most paramount one, but again, it's another context that everybody in this room shares in some capability.
Can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
I think there's one context as well. You're also a member of ID Pro, I think, right? That's important in this context.
That is a fantastic plug for a wonderful organization, yes. If you're not familiar with ID Pro, they are an organization whose mission as a nonprofit is to foster and facilitate the profession of digital identity. So if you want to learn more about it, they do have a booth here. Please stop by. So some of the other additional identity contexts we can look at is we can look at identity as an employee, so within the workforce context. We can look at it from a customer perspective in the sense that you're a customer of this conference, for example. You can also look at it from a consumer context. Now, what's the difference between consumer and customer? Subject to debate a little bit, but ultimately one of them absolutely will buy something, one of them may not. That's really what distinguishes them. And then we also talked about citizen identity, which doesn't get as much play at this conference as I think I would love to see in the future, but it's still an important context for us to understand. Now, I will pose a question to the group. Is there a context I'm missing here? Okay, not a problem. But kind of related to that, does anybody recognize this? It's an old-fashioned kaleidoscope. And I love this because this is a great analog for when we start talking about the concepts within digital identity. Just twisting that lens for those contexts can change what you're looking at in terms of which areas of focus come into focus. So within that, we're going to talk about perspectives for identity. And this is probably the most common Venn diagram most people in this field have seen, is the intersection between identity, security, and privacy. And it is useful. They are certainly complementary disciplines. I would argue one more so than other, but I am also heavily biased in this space. We'll talk more in a moment about why. But within that perspective, again, we see this context reappear of the various lenses by which we view identity. You have concepts, new ones come up like CIEM. That's Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. If you haven't heard of that one, that's for organizations, which most of us are out there, work with different cloud providers. So you may have infrastructure in Amazon, you may also have infrastructure in Google, and even in Azure. And how do we manage those entitlements? That's just a quick introduction to that concept. But this is also incomplete. I would make the argument where we would substitute where identity was for business management. The reason I say this is no business runs without identity in some concept. You can run a business, maybe not for long, without security. You can run it without privacy. Again, probably not for long. But you cannot run a business in today's world without identity. And that's why you see that triangle intersecting all three. That's what the triangle is meant to represent. I would expand it and add the concept of digital transformation. That's what every company on the planet is experiencing right now, because not only is my storefront on Main Street in a small town important, but for me to reach more customers, I need to have a presence online, even if it's just for my customers in that small town. And that's why that becomes so important. So the idea is, again, a biased perspective, identity is actually not this diagram anymore. I would make the argument that that Venn diagram is no longer valid. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about that later, but I suspect you'll see some additional themes on that later in this conference. Now, another perspective that you will get, and this is the classic one, just show of hands, has anybody heard of the CIA triad? Probably a healthy few, yeah. It's very common, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, what's interesting about this perspective is, and it's kind of supporting the argument that I just made, is you can't get to any of these objectives for maintaining confidentiality, integrity, and availability without identity. Whoops, went one too far. That's why I'm making that argument. It's bigger than that Venn diagram. Now, the other thing I do want to throw out there is an investor or market perspective. Now, I will tell you right now, this diagram has been updated and it's an eye chart, so it's not meant to be fully consumed. But it just gives you a sense of all of the different vendors and if we're being honest, sponsors in this conference that provide tooling and solutions to do that. I'll offer an alternative perspective, and it's one of the reasons why I love identity here. I don't know if anybody knows Yuri Levine. He was the founder of Waze. Everyone's probably familiar with Waze, right? So he wrote a really good book, and it was about entrepreneurship, but I love the concept behind it because it's central to why I love working in identity. Don't fall in love with the solution. Fall in love with the problem. The problems are never going to go away. That's why identity is not a race. It's a journey. And I think that's why this investor and market perspective will change over time as well, because the solutions are going to change. The nature of the problem is going to change as well. Now, another perspective that I do enjoy playing with, because I've spent much of my career in this space, is the architectural perspective. And this gives you a sense of all of the things that are at play when we start talking about identity. And this is why it gets a little bit overwhelming and it's considered complex. That's okay. You don't have to be masters of all of these elements. And then we can take another lens and we'll take a use case and simply say the user is going to access a SaaS app. For example, the CRA app on your phone. And these are all the aspects of that reference architecture that get invoked as part of that. So it gives you a little bit of a sense. Again, inch deep. So we're not meant to be masters of all of these things coming out of this session, just kind of understanding that they're out there. And then the final perspective that kind of ties it all together, and it's one of my favorites. Most identity problems, when you boil them down, boil to issues with one of two things. Either breakdowns in process or breakdowns in data. Oftentimes it's both. But what identity really does here is it ties together these processes, and these are four very related processes of validating an identity, authenticating them, making sure that they're actually who they say they are, the authorization, what you can do or where you can go, and finally that grant of access. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say Espen may have a perspective that may tie that together a little bit better.
It's a bit simple, this one, isn't it? So if we try
by design.
Huh? Yeah. But it's about perspectives, right? And you need to have many different perspectives in your, let's say, toolkit to be efficient as identity professionals. So if you go back one step to this one, this is meant to be an animation that lights up whenever each of these boxes are used, right? So let's try to do something like that, expanding this one. I mean, none of this is going to be a truth, because there are going to be many truths, right? You need to be good at asking questions. That's really what makes you good identity professionals. So everything we do here is try to give you more tools to do that. So let's take this process, for example. Starting with the validation. In the validation process, we try to collect some information. Preferably they are facts that we've proven about something. That makes it possible for us to do that process, or all the processes in authentication. And we're going to come back to what types that we have of those. So what we do in that aspect is saying that if we have validated the information, that makes it possible for someone or within our organization to create accounts. We typically use the user accounts, to be able to do the authentication. So if we have authenticated, then we have the option or the ability probably to create sessions. Sessions are represented by tokens. These tokens can be used to reference databases that we have of, well, who are actively logged in, and then we can use that, or we should use that, to find out what are they able to do in the systems. So authorization is that next steps that we had in the previous slide. And authorization, well, there are many flavors of authorization. And many of you need to dive deeper into what flavors that we have, and what are the differences between them. That's really a topic for another talk, though. But a key word here is the data, or the fact, or the attributes that you're going to check in conditions for whether that person has the ability to do this thing. So what we say in the text up here is that very often that authorization, if the conditions are complex, not just simple and coarse-grained, we need to do additional fact checks from somewhere. So we need to consult a swarm of data that you have collected. That's probably going to start in that first part there, the validation. So we need to have a swarm of data. Yeah. And very often that starts with something that resembles a human being that we can collect information about. That how good that process is going to affect all the rest of the processes within this. And we can do this manually, and we can do this automatically, or probably a combination. And those processes have, quality that can be high or low. So if you collect this about a person that is employed or contracting with us, that might be much easier than if it's a customer that we want to have some information about. That's typically known as the know your customer processes. One of the other, many acronyms that you will meet here. So this results in at least the beginnings of this swarm of facts that you can use for other parts of the process, if you find them reliable and if you know the people that manage them. There are other pieces, like that was mentioned before, like the consent. That's another group of facts or information that we need to know about. And the delegation parts, if we need to delegate the ability to do an action. So that fills out the picture a bit more. Just to note some things in here. What if this process is not about something that really resembles or actually is a human? What if this is something different? That means our processes to collect the data needs to be different. It needs to be governed and quality assured in a different way. And I think a red arrow here is in its place because the authentication part currently is where all the passwords are. And passwords, they're a weak link. We want them to go away, but we can't seem to make that happen very quickly. Anyway, we're getting there. And this is the I have permission from the cartoon before, right? So this fills it out a bit, but of course, there's always more. But you can use this as a starting point, and I hope that you can use this. If this makes you remember one thing, it's to identify the different stakeholders that manage different parts of this and make sure that you include them in your planning and your work when you work with identity. I think that brings it up to speed a little bit. Yeah. That's one perspective.
Now, if you had Homer Simpson on a Da Vinci diagram on your identity bingo card, you're lying because we didn't do that. But hopefully that kind of sums it up a little bit, and there will be a quiz at the end of the session. But it brings all of those pieces together, and they're somewhat, I would say, universal. So is this where the magic happens? The short answer is yes, but this again gets into that race analogy. By having these processes and these functions and mechanisms, we're achieving what we're calling good enough protection. It's not a minimal viable product. Hopefully you're not thinking that low. But it is good enough protection because ultimately your business, most companies are not in the business of security products, right? They're in the business of selling something else, and they're doing security to make sure that they can protect their customers, they can protect their data, and they can protect their product. And what they're trying to figure out is what investments can I make to achieve that good enough? And that's why we talk about this here. And really one of the things that this does draw out, and we're not going to go in any depth in this session, is those will show up at different points in those processes. One of the things we do distinguish here is between admin time versus runtime. Just going to introduce that concept because the rest of it really could be a talk unto itself. In fact, some of the authorization sessions that you may see later in the conference will do just that. Next, we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that is governance. And you're like, you're a glutton for punishment if that's your favorite subject. So why do we focus on identity governance? Well, the simple answer is the only constant that you have in the world of digital identity or digital assets is that the constant is change. I have been asked throughout my countless years, well, when are you done? My answer is, well, when are you going to stop changing your environment? When are you going to stop buying new applications? When is somebody going to stop whipping out their credit card for a Salesforce account? All of those things happen. So that's why we're not done. Now, when we start talking about governance, what does that mean? We're going to talk through specifically some of these areas, things like the context that we've already talked about, the workforce, the contractors, the partners and businesses. We're going to talk through what sources of truth mean, entitlement management, access requests, you get the idea. First, we're going to talk about sources of truth. This is a controversial topic in some lenses in that oftentimes you will have multiple sources of truth. Now, every company who has an identity program would love to go to the HR group and say, we would like to connect directly to your master data. And usually you get a robust round of laughter from your HRIS manager. They don't want anybody directly touching their data. And I kind of understand why. So you work out a balance within that. But usually most mature HR organizations will have a way of delivering that data so that you can consume it for identity purposes. That's in the business to enterprise context. In the business to business, oftentimes you're relying on the partner's HR data or designated admin, for example, a concierge within your trust relationship. In B2C, obviously, traditional consumer, you're talking about their individual, their social persona, sometimes the government identity. B2B2C, I'm not going to really go down a rabbit hole on this one. The short answer is it could be multiple sources. But a critical gap for a lot of these identity programs is the quality of that master data. If you're, the old analogy of garbage in, garbage out applies here. It's one of the central challenges I have at my organization is our HR data could be better as a retail organization.
I just want to add one thing. One of the trends we're seeing is that maybe this classically is true that you can find the sources of truth, but in many cases you yourself might have to curate a source of truth yourself, right? Because you cannot trust the others to do it for you. So that might happen that you need to collect a graph of data, for example, that you can use.
Yeah, that is certainly emerging a little bit. I'll admit I'm a bit of a curmudgeon in that space, partly because I don't want to sign up for that.
Doesn't need to be a graph, though, right?
Somebody else can be paid for that, and then I will gladly consume their service. But I do understand that some are voluntold that that's their reality. The next thing we're going to talk about is user provisioning and lifecycle management. This is the meat and potatoes of identity governance. This is where you create, maintain, and remove objects, usually in the form of users, but not necessarily. And also, this is where automation usually starts within the identity realm. The idea that you can automate your joiner processes. You hire somebody, that's a hiring event. You can pass that data along to your identity systems, credentials get created. Similarly, your mover event. This is the one that probably gets the most struggle within an organization because, okay, I'm no longer in HR, I'm now in marketing. Should I be retaining the HR access that I had previously? The short answer is probably not, but very few companies outside of the financial services realm typically have mature processes to evaluate that state. And then finally, the one that most companies generally get pretty good at is the leaver use case. Somebody leaves the organization, you can shut the front door and at least eliminate their primary access. Now, the garbage cleanup that happens with all the entitlements that we're going to talk about in a second, that's another story for another day.
Just a short comment on that. That joiner, mover, leaver is often also abbreviated into the JML processes. Yes. And I talk to many organizations that try to take that in one phase, saying, let's automate the joiner, mover, leaver. Don't do that. Try to start with joiner and leaver because mover is a whole different beast, right?
Very much so. So a little bit more about user provisioning. Again, you can have approval processes that are part of this. We have this today in my organization when it comes to hiring contractors. Making sure that there's awareness of who's moving about within your organization. Ideally, the goal for these processes is automation, but as Espen pointed out, correctly, some of them you don't necessarily want to automate just yet, especially if the processes are messy. The old joke that I use, and it's still been landing for the last 15 years, is you don't want to take a pig and put roller skates on it. At the end of the day, it's just a fast pig. And the results can be devastating as a result of that. Now, we are getting some standards that help in this space a little bit. One is known as the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. I did not create that name. It had a much better name before. You were going to say something?
Since you pointed out automation, I also wanted to say that I think one metric that you should try to have from year to year is to see that your level of automation increases. Because it's very easy to put in place these processes and have them be manual, and manual access certifications and so on. it's easy to get stuck in that. So try to plan for having an increased level of automation.
Absolutely.
Even if it's hard and you need better data to do it.
And probably goes without saying, but target your more mature use cases first. Those should be the ones that are easier to automate. So we've got the users taken care of. How do we handle entitlements? Well, there's an entire domain within this called entitlement management. Things like the ability to go into one of your primary financial systems and create a purchase order. And those permissions can often get aggregated into what we call macro level entitlements that create easier management. If your staff of 5 accountants all have access to the 6 same applications, that's beginnings of a role. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. This also includes adding and maintaining of meaningful descriptions. Now, we went back to that 3-letter acronym known as IGA, or Identity, Governance, and Administration. That's where you want to make sure that the data that you're ingesting oftentimes does not have really good descriptions on it. That can be a real challenge, both in terms of when they're approving that access. Well, I don't really know what this is, but they said they needed it, so I'll just approve it. That's not a great process, right? But the other one, and this is a sticky wicket, is the maintenance of owners. How many of you have really great processes for maintaining ownership of your security groups in your organization? Nobody's going to raise their hand for that one. Even if you did, you're not going to raise your hand.
By the way,
I'm going to test you.
I don't think that AI is going to help us much with this problem.
I do not. And we actually, I had originally thought AI was not going to make it into this talk, and Espen just changed that. So thank you. That's the third magic trick.
The recommendation engine to have good descriptions of the entitlements.
Yes. Yeah, because ChatGPT will get those wrong as well. So yeah, we'll talk about those as well. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room. And that is what's known as model after. If you haven't heard of model after, you've probably heard it in a variety of other names called. The short version of what model after is I hire a new employee, and I'm not really sure what they need access to, but we have another person on the team that I think is kind of close, so we'll just give him or her all the access that person has. That happened to me at my current job.
Well, are you talking about what AI does? That's what AI does, isn't it? Pattern matching?
Oh, that is a talk for another time, my friend. Yeah. When I landed, I had 1,800 notifications in my inbox as a brand new employee. Yeah. The good news is I'm very good at creating Outlook rules. But that's one of the things. Now, don't get me wrong. Here's a cardinal sin you can make. You just get rid of model after. You've got to have something to replace it with. That's where, again, your data has to be good enough to replace that. All right. So let's talk about role management. We talked about that a little bit with the accounting analogy, and that's kind of where we're getting. Now, typically, roles will show up in one of 2 flavors. They'll either be business-related roles, like the accounting analogy that I mentioned, or they can be technical ones. As the leader of our identity program, I may have a certain level of access that's coupled with a number of applications associated with that, just basically so that I can do my job. And there can also be partner classifications, for example. Certain partners, for example, most partners don't get access to your HR system, right? So there can be exclusions in there as well. And then, of course, now we get into more word salad.
Could you go one back, by the way, before we get into that? Because I realized when seeing this, if you see that bullet that says that roles, especially business roles, can be mapped to HR job codes and positions. Yeah, they can be mapped, and that's the easy thing to do. The point is that doesn't really, in a very good way, reflect what people do. So the thing that this should say is that roles should reflect what people actually do. So you need to know what people actually do at the organization. HR typically doesn't have that information. So I think that bullet there, if we replace that text, that's going to be the main, job task for many of you. Yeah. Roles need to reflect what people do, but we don't know what people do. That's a core concept.
And that's a central challenge to identity.
In identity, we need to give people access based on what they need, right? Least privilege. If we don't know what they do, well, what do we do?
It's hard to answer that. That's why And that's one other, again, falling in love with the problem of identity. One of the things I love about it is I get to talk to everybody. Now, sometimes that's not always a great thing, but most of the time it is, because you're fundamental to helping them solve their business challenges. Ideally, they should receive that well. Sometimes not as much. But we do want to talk about the acts. That's role-based access control, attribute-based access control, and policy-based access control, and we have plus because there's some other ones that are out there. The purpose of including this isn't to get detailed into what they are per se, but just know that this is one mechanism by which you can generate what I call plenary levels of access control. Policy is the one area where it's kind of an exception to that. You could get very granular within that, even with respect to attribute-based access controls. But at the end of the day, they're really being used to make decisions about what you have access to.
And these labels are very often used by vendors to try to differentiate what they're doing, right? So ABAC, for example, it's typically the same thing as PBAC. And RBAC, it's just a subset of ABAC because it's all about the data we collected before, right? So if companies use these acronyms to label their products, try to ask them what they really mean by it and make that understandable in the concept we talked about before.
Yeah, and RBAC oftentimes is the acronym that oftentimes or I'll call them identity muggles, if you will, latch onto of when do we get to RBAC? To which I always answer, when is your data going to get better? So usually that shuts them up for a little while, but not long enough. So now let's talk about everybody's favorite subject. If you haven't been introduced to this, this will become one of your favorite subjects. That is access certification. That's a central part of governance. And that is basically asking either, I shouldn't say either or, but I'll stick with that for now, either your reporting manager or the application owner, if that user should, or service account, should retain its levels of permission and access to an associated resource. It's a simple process. It's very easy to do. That's sarcasm, just in case that wasn't clear. And that's, again, going back to the descriptions conversation. That's why descriptions are so essential. Okay, I see this account, and Espen has access to this account, but it says he has root access to server XYZ123. That doesn't tell me anything. I'm going to go, Espen, you probably still need access to that, right?
Yeah, I need it for my job.
Yeah, okay, cool. And that's unfortunately what happens with a lot of access certification programs. You get into, if you were in the previous session, they talked about MFA fatigue. You're just pushing the button and saying yes. That oftentimes happens in access certification programs if you don't have good data that can explain to the certifier what they are in fact certifying.
There's a very important word on this slide here, and that's on the last line, that's scope. Because if access certifications are scoped to be hundreds of questions that you're continuously going to ask a line manager, for example, to answer, it's not going to be a good process. Well, except the auditors will be happy that you have it. So scope for access certifications should be smaller than you currently have them. That's my advice. So you scope it, and this is what the text says, right? Try to find ways to scope it like to one person or a smaller group of person, because that means it's possible to do that job of access certificate, reapproval, as it could be called.
Yep. Yeah, and that's one of the areas where this is a continuous improvement opportunity. You get your data better, get your certifiers better trained using a good platform. And this is also where user experience. We don't talk about that a lot at this conference, but how easy is it for my certifiers to accurately evaluate a person's access and say yes, because I may wind up saying that answer yes a lot. And you have that sliding scale of how easy do you make it versus it becomes just a sort of, a checkbox process.
Try to automate things that don't need to be certified, for example.
Yes, that's again where scoping is critical. One of the other things we're going to talk about briefly is identity analytics. And if you were to go to an identity conference 10 years ago, all you could hear about was identity analytics. Now it's called AI or machine learning. But it was the idea that every product out there could analyze the identities that you had and give you knowledgeable insights about the appropriate access for a particular user. Again, the pig on roller skates analogy applies here. If the data is not good, you're not going to be capable of making good decisions about it. But it does give you some insights. Not saying it's completely useless.
So there is another piece of advice. You just, if in case you're starting to set up an IGA platform, for example, which a lot of people need to do at some point, very often what they should have done first is to try to do analytics. I mean, do it with Excel or Access Database or whatever you need to do, but start to get insights into your data. Preferably a year before you try to implement an IGA suite.
Yeah, if we have any old security professionals in here, you're probably familiar with the old intrusion detection platform, right? Well, if an attacker's already on your network and you run your baseline for your intrusion detection system, that looks normal. That's why data is so critical to get right before you start doing things like identity analytics, to Espen's point. And then the final one within this space, we'll talk a little bit about validation and proofing of identities. Espen talked a little bit about this earlier. Most organizations from a workforce perspective probably do this somewhat decently. There's so much you have to do in the United States to be certified as an employee. You have to go through the I-9 process, for example. So there does get to a level of confidence in that interval. But once you get outside of the employee context, that becomes a little bit looser to play with. And it's actually an upside in that you have a little bit more flexibility in that space. But you also wind up having to ask yourself the question, how much do I trust this data?
Because what you're saying here is that very often that validation process is done by someone else outside of your organization, and you don't know how well they did it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes we do that by design because we want them to assume the risk for the validation process. But that's another talk for another time. And so there are concepts out there. One of the things that is shifting, I don't know how successful it is, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least introduce the concept here, is the idea of, can we flip this equation from centralized identities to decentralized identities? And that's the idea that the users can start to take ownership of some of the critical elements that are related to their identity portfolio. Again, there's a number of sessions here. You can go much deeper into these, but decentralized self-sovereign identity, these are central to that idea that you are in control of that. And then there's also the concept known as verified credentials. Just quick show of hands, how many of you have a mobile driver's license on your phone? Just curious. Yeah, that kind of plays out. We're still getting there, is the short answer. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention another verified credential, which is known as the CID Pro, which is the only vendor-neutral certification in the identity industry for identity professionals. It is also a verified credential through Credly. So now we're going to talk a little bit about privileged access. Again, that mile-wide, inch-deep idea here. But one of the challenges that we have with privileged access is some people think it's a well-defined term, but it really isn't. What constitutes something as being privileged? Under what circumstances is read-only access considered privileged? Probably depends on the data type, right? Which access is more privileged than the next? Ultimately, at the end of the day, your business typically decides on that. Now, regulatory frameworks will also help you decide on that. For example, SOX framework. NIST has a wonderful cybersecurity framework will help guide you on some of those decisions. At the end of the day, though, you're probably going to be making some of those decisions. And you're going to be doing so in conjunction with your business, which that also, again, you're sensing a theme here, comes back to data. How good is your configuration management database? That's the database that tells you all of the data endpoints that are in your organization, setting aside the cloud piece, because I think Espen's probably going to have a comment on this. If you don't know what it is and you don't know that you have it, how can you secure it? Similarly,
my point was mainly about the fact that you need to know which of these are risk classified in a specific way. And that it goes back to what I said about, well, is there a source of truth for it? And this is why it said that your business must decide that.
Right.
But you're probably going to be the ones to have to force them to decide that and help them do the risk classification in a way that doesn't spend all your time and kill all your processes.
All right, and so this slide, again, this is calling out some of the more conventional perspectives on privileged access management. Root accounts on Linux servers, easiest target for you, right? Now we're going to talk briefly about authentication and authorization. There are far more sessions talking about this, but just to give you a sense, authentication, if you're not familiar with it, is This idea that give me your identifier, which, oh, by the way, is not sensitive information, and assure me, go through a transaction that helps me from an assurance standpoint that it's you. And we'll use the identifiers and the assurance mechanisms as input, and that gives us some level of confidence as output. Whereas authorization seeks to tell you what you can do, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, I do want to call out here just briefly, when we are talking about authentication for the purposes of this session, we're predominantly talking about user-based identities, not machine-based identities. That's a whole separate kettle of fish and a different talk. But conventionally speaking, we call this out. This is if you're familiar with Canva, you're familiar with this login flow. You can log in with your Facebook account, you can log in with your Google account. Those are identifiers. Those are not factors of authentication. Authenticators are factors. We'll talk about those in a second. So email plus password, some of you are probably saying, duh, that is not multi-factor authentication. And I know that gets a laugh, but that is a common misconception. So when we talk about authentication, we're talking about active factors. That's the concept of knowledge, something you know, possession, something you have, and inherence, something you are. In passive context, you can add other pieces to the puzzle that, again, further improve that context in order to validate a session.
And this is developing a bit, so it gets less and less clear what's actually a knowledge factor and what's a possession factor if it's something that's coupled with biometric thing on your device that you need to, get access to. Right. So these are getting combined. So this, distinction here will not in the future be so easy to, see. It's going to be more of a full picture of how well do these factors play together in our architecture. Absolutely,
and similarly, people will ask questions, well, what about password managers? If my password manager is also the source for my TOTP, or time-based one-time password, see, I kept with the acronyms, but I give you the explanation. Is that multi-factor? I went to one place for it. It's a good topic for debate. It's still much stronger than just username and password. Passkeys are a whole separate topic. Many, many wonderful sessions on that. I am super excited about the prospect of passkeys. We still have a ways to go to realize some of the promise of them. But by the end of the conference, you will learn a lot about FIDO Alliance and some of the great work that they're doing.
Just a comment about time here. I know we are soon at time. We are going to try to stretch your time a bit, but we're going to let you leave so you have time to get to the keynote.
Absolutely. So we're going to get through authorization pretty briefly. I am going to use parkrun again because this is a runtime thing. Get it? No? Oh, man. Boom. I'll be here all night. Be sure to tip your server. So authentication is settled. How do we know what you can do or where you can go? And so within the parkrun analogy, my runners that just participated in the event, they only get read access to the data. They're going to get an email that says, hey, you ran this time and you were really good. Volunteers, however, are going to get write access to the application so that they can submit the times, but they can't edit it. So if the mistake is made, they have to let the race director know, and the race director then has admin level rights where they can edit those. So that's just, again, another analogy that kind of gives you a sense of what authorization does in this space. It both determines where you can go, in other words, what resources you have access to, and what you can do with those resources in a very broad perspective. We're going to get through these. Final run through additional concepts. One of the Achilles heel of modern identity is recovery. Something happens, how do we get it back? And more importantly, how do I know that you're getting it back, that you're actually the person getting it back? That's really critical with account recovery. And we don't do it super well. I've seen very few organizations that do it great. I think we're getting better. Credential recovery, very similar issue. Identity recovery. When the Office of Personnel Management in the federal government got hacked by China, a lot of people lost some very important data. How do you recover somebody's life story? Can you?
And if this impacts the validation process that we relied on before, well, where does it put us?
If I'm using my fingerprints to get into a system and somebody else has those fingerprints, how good of an authenticator is that? I can't ask for a new fingerprint. I can ask for a new social security number.
There's another point by that, by the way. Recovery processes are often just one-to-one. One person loses their account and so on, right? But it's also part of disaster recovery. If you've had a breach, you may very well need to rely on the recovery processes to recovery for everyone. Plan for that, because that's not easy to plan for and implement when you're in the thick of it.
Yep. So some final concepts. Assurance. We've kind of talked about this skimming the surface. It's a central concept in identity and access of how certain are we that these things are true. That's really what it boils down to. We talked a little bit about portable identities, so I won't belabor that one. I do want to talk a little bit briefly about attack types. What type of identity attacks are we seeing? In any of the sessions you're going to hear about them, account takeover is the most common one. There's also this new industry category.
Newish.
I'll be the first one to admit I'm a bit of a curmudgeon on this. ITDR is known as Identity Threat Detection and Response. Not to be confused with XDR or MDR, and that's where my beef is. But it is a combination of functionality that basically says what unique threats are we seeing in the identity space, and how can we get those signals to the appropriate entities in order to respond.
So the thing with this is not a set of products, for example, even though some vendors would say that. This is something that you could do with your existing processes, or you could get your XDR or your other parts of your organization to provide some of these capabilities. Right.
Yep. So CIAM we've already talked about, so I'm not going to belabor that one. This is a list of, and again, these slides are going to be available to you. This is a list of educational and other resources. By no means meant to be exhaustive, but if you are new to the identity space, if you start with these links, you have a wealth of knowledge available to you. And finally, I would like to make a note of gratitude. The work that went into this talk began 4 years ago with people like Ian Glazer, Pam Dingle, Steve Hutchinson, Alan Foster, and in the past 2 years, Espen Bago and myself have been doing this. And as Isaac Newton once said, if I have seen further, it is only because I have been standing on the shoulders of giants. And what I want to see is who in this room might be giving this talk, maybe not next year, maybe, but in the future, or have something to share. Because that's what makes this conference great, is we all have experiences, and you can all share them if you choose to do so. So with that said, thank you very much. That's a QR code to my LinkedIn profile. On the right is to my blog, where I will post the slides, although they will be available through the app as well. Thank you very much.
Feel free to reach out to us if you see us walking around the conference.
Absolutely.